4-year-old beggar girl is dumped in a lot full of trash, but a billionaire saw everything and did something that shocked everyone. Watch until the end, you won't regret it. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The chilly June morning arrived in the Appalachian Mountains, bringing with it a thick fog that draped over the small town of Havenwood like a grey shroud. The cold bit through the skin, driving residents indoors to warm their hands around mugs of hot cocoa. But for Juniper Hayes, just 4 years old, this morning would be unlike any other she had ever experienced. The shout of Dale Harding echoed through the small, dilapidated trailer where she lived with Brenda, his 28-year-old girlfriend, and the stepdaughter he considered a burdensome weight. At 35, Dale worked as a mechanic at a garage downtown, but his explosive temper and penchant for alcohol kept him teetering on the edge of poverty and violence. "Brenda, where's the rent money?" he bellowed, ransacking drawers and cupboards. With growing desperation, his large, calloused hands trembled, not only from the morning chill, but from the rage bubbling in his veins. Brenda cowered in the corner of the kitchen, clutching Juniper to her chest. The girl was pale and feverish, coughing frequently, her small eyes gleaming with the weariness of someone who hadn't slept well in days. Juniper's dark, tangled hair clung to her sweaty face, and her tattered clothes barely protected her from the cold seeping in through the cracks in the walls. I needed to buy medicine for Juniper," Brenda murmured, her voice as soft as a whisper. "She had a high fever and cough. The doctor said it was important." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Dale stopped rummaging through the drawers and slowly turned to face his girlfriend. His dark eyes glinted with a cold fury that made Brenda shrink even further. "You spent the rent money on this kid?" The words came out slowly, laced with a veiled threat that made Juniper begin to cry softly. Brenda tried to explain, to talk about how her daughter had spent the entire night with a high fever, how desperate she had been, not knowing what to do. But Dale didn't want to hear any explanations. To him, Juniper had always been the problem, the reason why he could never save money, the constant reminder that Brenda had a relationship before him. "Dale, please, she's just a child," Brenda pleaded, but the words were lost in the air as he approached with heavy steps. "A child who isn't my responsibility," he growled, grabbing Juniper by the arms and pulling her away from her mother. "A child who eats our food, spends our money, and gives us nothing in return." What happened in the following minutes would forever be etched in Juniper's memory. Dale carried her out of the trailer, ignoring her screams and Brenda's desperate protests. The girl didn't understand what was happening, only felt the biting cold of the morning wind and saw the world rushing by as she was carried by hands that showed no affection. Across the street, on the second floor of an office building, Harrison Caldwell adjusted his tie in front of his office mirror. At 52, he had built an empire in the grocery sector, transforming a small store inherited from his father into a chain that served the entire Appalachian region. His elegant office stood in stark contrast to the poverty of the houses around it. But Harrison had chosen to keep his company in the town where he was born, even though he could have moved to the state capital. His graying hair was perfectly combed, and his dark suit reflected the financial success he had achieved through years of hard work and calculated decisions. Harrison was known for his controlling and meticulous personality, traits that had made him a respected businessman, but also an isolated and distrustful man. It was as he walked to the window to observe the street activity that Harrison witnessed, a scene that would change his life forever. Through the glass, he saw Dale crossing the street with a small child in his arms, heading towards the vacant lot directly in front of his building. The lot had been abandoned for years, filled with rubble, accumulated garbage, and the wreckage of old buildings. Tall weeds grew among the debris, and the unpleasant smell emanating from the place made everyone avoid passing by. It was here that Dale decided to leave Juniper. Harrison watched, initially uncomprehending, as the man placed the child on the ground among piles of trash and debris. The girl cried and tried to follow him, but Dale pushed her back and walked away quickly, without looking back even once. "My God," Harrison murmured, his hands tightening against the window glass. Juniper remained there among the wreckage, crying and calling out for someone who could no longer hear her. The businessman felt something strange stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He immediately remembered Isabella, his only daughter, who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. The girl was only 6 years old when she passed, and since then Harrison had shut himself off emotionally, focusing all his energy on business and avoiding any situation that could reawaken the pain of loss. But seeing that small, defenseless child abandoned like garbage awakened in him a deep anguish. Juniper was about the same age that Isabella would be now, and her dark hair and large eyes painfully reminded him of the daughter he had lost. Harrison stood at the window for long minutes, watching as Juniper tried to find a more sheltered place among the wreckage. The girl was clearly sick, her movements were slow, and she stopped constantly to cough. The morning cold made her shiver, and her inadequate clothes offered no protection against the icy wind of the mountains. Part of him wanted to go down immediately and help the child, but his controlling and distrustful nature paralyzed him. Harrison had learned to distrust people and their motivations, and even in the face of such a clearly unjust situation, his calculating mind warned him about the possible problems he could face if he got involved. What if it was a setup? What if someone was trying to take advantage of his compassion? What if he became attached to that child and she was also taken from his life? The questions multiplied in his mind, creating an almost insurmountable barrier between his conscience and his ability to act. Meanwhile, Juniper had found a small shelter between 2 piles of debris and huddled there, trying to protect herself from the cold and the confusion that filled her thoughts. She didn't understand why the man who lived in her house had brought her to that scary place, nor why her mother hadn't come to get her. Hunger began to gnaw at her small stomach, mixing with the nausea caused by the fever. Juniper looked around and saw pieces of spoiled food scattered among the trash. Her childish mind didn't yet fully understand the gravity of her situation, but her survival instinct was already beginning to manifest. Harrison remained at the window until the morning fog completely swallowed the small figure among the wreckage. Then he forced himself to walk away and try to concentrate on work, but the image of Juniper didn't leave his mind. Throughout that morning, he found excuses to return to the window, always searching for the small silhouette in the vacant lot. What he didn't know was that this had been just the first of many mornings in which he would observe the desperate struggle of a child for survival, and that each day that passed without acting would make his own suffering more unbearable. 3 days had passed since Juniper was abandoned in the vacant lot, and the little girl had transformed into a shadow of her former self. Her rosy cheeks were now pale and hollow, her eyes had lost their childish sparkle, and the fever that already bothered her had intensified dangerously. During the cold nights, she huddled between wet cardboard boxes and scraps of fabric found in the trash, trembling uncontrollably while delirious with a high fever. On the first morning, Juniper had cried non-stop, calling for her mother and hoping that someone would come to get her. But as the hours passed and no one appeared, the child began to understand, with the tragic wisdom that only the very young possess, that she was completely alone in the world. Hunger was the first enemy she learned to face. Her small, dirty fingers rummaged through piles of trash in search of anything edible. She found pieces of moldy bread, remains of spoiled fruit, and leftover food that residents threw away. Each bite was a battle against disgust and fear, but the need to survive spoke louder than any repulsion. Harrison couldn't concentrate on anything other than the girl in the lot. During those 3 days, he had cancelled 2 important meetings and lost a significant contract because his mind was constantly turned towards the window. His employees began to notice his distraction, but none of them dared to question the behavior of the boss, known for his rigidity and absolute control. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, Harrison had a moment of weakness and almost went down to help Juniper. He had seen the girl trip and fall among the wreckage, remaining still for several minutes. His heart tightened so much that he even placed his hand on the doorknob, but at the last moment, the painful memories of Isabella paralyzed him again. Isabella had been everything to him. After the loss of his wife during childbirth, he had dedicated himself entirely to his daughter, trying to be both a father and a mother at the same time. The girl was cheerful, intelligent, and affectionate, always running through the company's corridors and winning the hearts of all the employees. When he lost her in that terrible accident, Harrison swore to himself that he would never again allow himself to love someone so deeply, because the pain of loss was simply unbearable. On the other side of town, Brenda was living her own hell. Dale had lied to her, saying that he had taken Juniper to her maternal grandmother's house in the countryside. For 2 days, Brenda believed the story, relieved to know that her daughter was safe. But when she tried to call her mother-in-law to find out how Juniper was doing, she discovered a devastating truth. What girl, Brenda? Dale didn't bring any. "A child here," said the confused voice of the elderly woman on the other end of the line. "I haven't seen you in months." The phone slipped from Brenda's trembling hands, shattering on the kitchen's ceramic floor. At that moment, she understood that she had been deceived in the worst possible way. Dale hadn't taken Juniper anywhere safe. He had simply gotten rid of her. The discovery transformed Brenda into a desperate woman. She confronted Dale as soon as he arrived home from work, demanding to know where her daughter was. The man, cornered by the lie, exploded in fury and coldly confessed what he had done. "I got rid of that pest," he shouted, pushing Brenda against the wall. "She was spending our money, eating our food, and I got tired of supporting another man's daughter." Brenda felt the world collapse around her. She ran out of the house, leaving Dale behind, and began a desperate search through the streets of Havenwood. She searched every alley, every empty lot, every place where a child could be hidden. She cried as she shouted Juniper's name, begging for someone to have seen her. Meanwhile, on the 3rd day of abandonment, Juniper had found a small, makeshift shelter between 2 piles of debris. Her fever was so high that she began to hallucinate, talking to imaginary people and calling for the mother who couldn't find her. Her lips were dry and cracked, and she barely had the strength to move. It was at this critical moment that something extraordinary happened. A stray dog, thin and with matted fur, appeared in the vacant lot. The animal had been abandoned there for weeks and survived by eating the same scraps of food that Juniper competed for. But upon seeing the sick and defenseless child, something awakened in the dog's maternal instinct. The dog cautiously approached Juniper and lay down beside her, offering the warmth of her body to protect her from the cold. During the most critical night, when the girl's fever reached its peak, it was the warmth of that unexpected companionship that probably saved her life. Harrison witnessed this touching scene from his window on the morning of the 3rd day. Seeing that sick child being cared for by an abandoned animal was the final blow to his emotional defenses. He realized that he was watching a human tragedy unfold before his eyes, and that his inaction made him complicit in the suffering of an innocent. At that moment, Harrison made a decision that would change his life forever. He called Muriel Albright, his trusted housekeeper of over 15 years, and asked her to prepare the mansion's guest room. Muriel, a 58-year-old woman with grey hair and a maternal heart, didn't ask any questions. She had noticed her boss's growing anguish in recent days and knew that something important was happening. When Harrison finally came down from the building and crossed the street towards the vacant lot, Juniper was semi-conscious, delirious with fever. The dog growled softly as he approached, instinctively protecting the child she had adopted as her own pup. "It's okay, girl," Harrison murmured, crouching carefully beside Juniper. "I'm here to help you." When he picked up the child in his arms, he felt how she was too light, too hot, too fragile. Juniper opened her eyes for a moment and stared at him with an expression of confusion and fear, but she was too weak to resist. The dog followed them as Harrison carried Juniper out of the lot, as if she knew she was handing over her protectee to someone who could take better care of her. But while Harrison finally yielded to compassion and saved Juniper, Brenda continued her desperate search through the town's streets, unaware that her daughter was being taken to a mansion on the other side of town, where a new life, full of possibilities and new challenges, was about to begin. Harrison Caldwell's mansion stood majestically in Havenwood's most upscale neighborhood, surrounded by manicured gardens and high walls that shielded the property from prying eyes. When he arrived carrying Juniper in his arms, Muriel Albright was already waiting at the front door with clean towels and a basin of warm water prepared. Muriel had worked at the mansion for 15 years, arriving shortly after Isabella's birth. She had witnessed all the family's moments of joy and had also seen the devastation that had befallen Harrison after losing his daughter. During those 3 years of mourning, she became much more than a housekeeper. She was the only person he trusted completely and who was allowed to question his decisions. "Good heavens," Muriel whispered upon seeing Juniper's condition. "This child is very sick, Mr. Caldwell. We need to call a doctor immediately." Harrison nodded, carrying Juniper to the guest room located on the mansion's ground floor. The room was spacious and bright, with walls painted in soft tones and a comfortable bed that seemed like a palace compared to the cold, dirty floor where the girl had slept in recent days. As Muriel began to clean Juniper's little face with maternal care, the child opened her eyes and stared at her with an expression of confusion mixed with hope. There was something in the gentleness of that grey-haired woman that awakened in her an old memory of care and affection. "Where's my mommy?" Juniper asked in her weak, hoarse voice. It was the first question she had asked since she had been found, and the words came out like an almost inaudible whisper. Muriel felt her heart tighten. She looked at Harrison, who remained standing in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional situation he had created by bringing the child home. He was a man accustomed to solving problems with money and planning, but here he was faced with a situation that demanded something much more complex: genuine human compassion. "You're safe now, little one," Muriel said, avoiding answering the question directly. "We're going to take care of you until you're well and strong again." Dr. Bennett Shaw arrived at the mansion 2 hours later, called urgently by Harrison. The 60-year-old doctor was an old family friend and had cared for Isabella throughout her short life. When he examined Juniper, his face hardened with the gravity of what he found. "This child is severely malnourished and dehydrated," he told Harrison in private after finishing the examination. "She has early-stage pneumonia and clear signs of prolonged neglect. A few more days in those conditions and, well, I don't even want to think about what could have happened." Harrison felt a wave of guilt for having taken so long to act. For 3 days, he had passively watched the suffering of an innocent child because of his own unresolved fears and traumas. "Will she recover?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "With proper care, yes. but it will take time. In addition to the physical problems, she has clearly undergone severe psychological trauma. I recommend you also seek a child psychologist. During the first few days at the mansion, Juniper oscillated between moments of improvement and worrying relapses. The fever took a long time to come down completely, and she frequently woke up crying during the night, calling for her mother and getting scared by the unfamiliar environment. It was Muriel who became her emotional anchor in those difficult days. The housekeeper practically didn't leave the girl's side, feeding her patient spoonfuls of warm soup, telling her gentle stories to help her sleep, and offering the maternal affection that Juniper had lost so brutally. Harrison, in turn, maintained a careful distance. He paid for the best doctors, bought the most expensive medications, and ensured that Juniper had everything she needed materially, but he avoided creating direct emotional bonds with the child. Whenever she tried to approach him or ask questions, he found an excuse to leave the room. This dynamic created a growing tension in the house. Muriel began to realize that her boss was repeating the same pattern of emotional isolation that he had adopted after the loss of Isabella, and this worried her deeply. She knew that Juniper needed stability and genuine affection to recover completely, and she also realized that Harrison desperately needed to reconnect with his own humanity. After 2 weeks, when Juniper was already physically recovered and starting to timidly explore the mansion, something happened that would change the dynamic between them all. The girl found a box stored in the closet of the room where she was staying, full of toys and books that had belonged to Isabella. When Harrison found her playing with a doll that had been his daughter's 4th birthday present, he felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. For a terrible moment, it was as if time had turned back and Isabella was there again, alive and smiling. "Sorry," Juniper said immediately, noticing the expression of pain on his face. "I didn't know I couldn't play." The innocence in her voice broke something inside Harrison. For the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to sit on the floor next to a child and talk about his lost daughter. He told Juniper about Isabella, about how she liked to play with that doll, about how smart and affectionate she was. Juniper listened with the seriousness that only children possess when they realize that an adult is sharing something very important. When Harrison finished speaking, she held out the doll to him. "Do you want to play with me? The doll can be Isabella, and we can pretend she's here," she said with all the simplicity of her 4 years. It was at that moment that Harrison understood that he wasn't betraying Isabella's memory by caring for Juniper. In fact, perhaps it was exactly the opposite. Perhaps caring for a child who needed him was the best way to honor the love he felt for the daughter he had lost. But while that emotional connection was finally beginning to form in the mansion, on the other side of town, Brenda had intensified her desperate search for Juniper. She had gone to the police, but without financial resources to pressure a proper investigation, her case had been filed as just another disappearance of a poor child. It was when she was posting flyers with Juniper's photo on the streetlights of Main Street that a neighbor approached with information that would change everything. "Brenda, I saw your girl," said Mrs. Olson, an elderly woman who lived near the vacant lot. "A few weeks ago, a rich man took her from there, a very well-dressed man with an expensive car." Brenda's heart stopped. Finally, after weeks of fruitless searching, she had a concrete lead about her daughter's whereabouts, but the information also awakened in her a terrible fear. Who was this man? What did he want with Juniper? Why had he taken her? Determined to discover the truth, Brenda began to investigate on her own. She questioned other residents of the area, searched the wealthy neighborhoods of the town, and finally discovered that the man described by Mrs. Olson could only be Harrison Caldwell, the best-known and wealthiest businessman in Havenwood. When she confirmed his identity, Brenda felt an explosive mixture of relief and fury. Relief at knowing that Juniper was alive and apparently safe, but fury at discovering that a stranger had kidnapped her daughter and had been keeping her away from her for weeks. The next morning, Brenda headed to Harrison's mansion, determined to confront him and get her daughter back. She had no idea that she was about to unleash a legal and emotional battle that would test the limits of everyone involved and force decisions that would forever change Juniper's destiny. The gate of Harrison Caldwell's mansion opened with a metallic clang that echoed through Havenwood's silent morning. Brenda Hayes walked up the stone driveway with determined steps, but her heart was beating erratically inside her chest. 27. Days had passed since Juniper disappeared from her life, and now she was finally close to reuniting with her daughter. Muriel answered the door, and upon seeing the desperate face of the young woman in front of her, something familiar stirred in her memory. There was something in those dark eyes, in that determined expression, that made her hesitate for a moment before speaking. "May I help you?" Muriel asked, trying to maintain professional courtesy despite the nervousness that was beginning to take hold of her. "I want my daughter back," Brenda said, her voice filled with a mixture of pain and contained fury. "I know she's here. I know you took her from the vacant lot almost a month ago." Muriel felt the world spin around her. At that moment, all the pieces fit together in her mind like a cruel puzzle of fate. The girl she had cared for so tenderly in recent weeks was the daughter of the woman standing before her. And that woman was Brenda, Muriel whispered, her voice trembling with the discovery. "Brenda Hayes." Brenda frowned, looking more closely at the housekeeper. There was something familiar in that mature face, in those gentle eyes that seemed to hide old secrets. "How do you know my name?" she asked, taking a step back. Muriel leaned against the doorframe, feeling her legs weaken. For 43 years, she had carried a secret that she thought she would never have to reveal. A secret that had begun when she was only 15 years old and had been forced by the cruel circumstances of poverty to make the most painful decision of her life. "Because I'm your mother," Muriel said, the words coming out like a whisper loaded with decades of silent suffering. The silence that followed was deafening. Brenda felt as if the ground had disappeared from under her feet. Throughout her life, she'd grown up believing that her parents had passed away when she was a baby, that she had been raised by a distant aunt who never showed much affection. "That's impossible," Brenda murmured. But even as she denied it, she could see the familiar traits in Muriel's face, the same curve of the eyes, the same shape of the nose. Muriel closed her eyes, gathering courage to tell a story that she had kept buried for decades. "I was 15 when you were born. Your Aunt Bernice, my older sister, couldn't have children. She and her husband offered me money to have you and give you to them. I was very young, very poor, very scared. I thought you would have a better life with them." Brenda felt tears streaming down her face as she processed the revelation. Her entire life had been built on a lie, on a financial transaction that had separated mother and daughter before they could even meet. At that moment, Harrison appeared in the hall, alerted by the movement at the entrance. Upon seeing the two women crying, one with her back to the other, he knew immediately that something extraordinary was happening. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. It was then that a small and familiar voice echoed through the mansion. "Mommy!" Juniper shouted, running down the stairs. The girl had heard Brenda's voice and recognized it immediately, even after weeks of separation. Brenda turned and saw her daughter running towards her, her hair shiny and clean, her cheeks rosy with health, wearing a beautiful dress that contrasted drastically with the tattered clothes she was wearing when she was abandoned. Juniper's physical transformation was impressive, but it was the radiant smile on her face that broke Brenda's heart. "My little one," Brenda cried, kneeling to receive. Her daughter in her arms. Mummy looked for you so much. Mummy never stopped looking for you. Juniper snuggled into her mother's lap, but her eyes constantly sought out Muriel and Harrison, creating a complex emotional tension that no one knew how to resolve. "I was sick, Mommy," Juniper said in her childish voice, "but Grandma Muriel took care of me. And Uncle Harrison has a daughter named Isabella, but she went away to heaven." The innocence with which Juniper described her new life in the mansion made Brenda understand that her daughter had found something there that she never had at home: stability, proper medical care, and above all, genuine love. Harrison watched the scene with a heavy heart. In recent weeks, he had become more attached to Juniper than he wanted to admit. The girl's presence had brought new life to the silent mansion and had helped to heal wounds in his heart that he thought were incurable. "Brenda," Muriel said, cautiously approaching the daughter she had given away so many years ago, "I need you to know that I cared for Juniper as if she were my own granddaughter, because she is my granddaughter." Brenda looked up, still holding Juniper in her lap. "Why didn't you ever look for me? Why didn't you ever tell me the truth?" "Because I was afraid," Muriel admitted, tears streaming freely down her face. "Afraid that you would hate me for abandoning you. Afraid of interfering in the life you had built. But when I saw Juniper in that terrible state, when I knew she was your daughter, my heart broke into pieces." It was then that Harrison made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of behaving like the controlling businessman he had always been, he chose to act with his heart. "Brenda," he said, approaching the group, "I know I have no legal rights over Juniper, but she has become very important to me. I would like to propose something that may benefit all of us." Brenda stared at him distrustfully. "What do you mean?" "I want to help you, financially, emotionally, as a family. Muriel is like a mother to me, and now we discover that you are her blood family. Juniper could have the best of both worlds, the love of her mother and the stability that I can offer." Brenda hesitated, looking at Juniper, who was listening to the conversation with the seriousness that only children possess when they know that important decisions are being made. "I don't want your money," Brenda said finally. "I just want my daughter back." "And you'll have her," Harrison replied. "But you can also have so much more. Juniper has taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about people who care for each other, who protect and love each other unconditionally." Muriel approached Brenda and, for the first time in 43 years, touched her daughter's face with the tenderness she had kept for decades of regret. "Forgive me," she whispered. "Forgive me for abandoning you. Forgive me for not being brave enough to fight for you when I was young. But now I can fight for Juniper, for you, for our family." In the months that followed, a completely new family dynamic was established. Brenda and Juniper moved into a comfortable house that Harrison had bought for them, located just 2 blocks from the mansion. Muriel divided her time between the 2 residences, finally being able to openly exercise her role as a mother and grandmother. Harrison discovered that being Juniper's uncle was more rewarding than he had imagined. The girl brought joy back into his life, and through her he learned to honor Isabella's memory, not through isolation, but through shared love. Dale, confronted with the evidence of his cruel abandonment, faced the legal consequences of his actions and lost any rights. Over the family he had destroyed, Brenda finally found the courage to separate from him definitively. 6 months later, on a sunny December afternoon, Juniper celebrated her 5th birthday at a party in the garden of Harrison's mansion. The table was filled with sweets and presents, and the yard full of laughter and animated conversations. When they asked her to make a wish before blowing out the candles, Juniper closed her eyes for a moment and then smiled with the surprising wisdom she had developed through her trials. "I wish that our family will stay together forever," she said, looking at Brenda, Muriel and Harrison, "and that other lost children will also find their families." As everyone applauded and Juniper blew out the candles, no one could hold back the tears. There was the living proof that even in the cruelest circumstances, true love always finds a way to flourish and heal the deepest wounds of the human heart. The girl who had been abandoned like trash in a vacant lot had become the center of a family rebuilt by forgiveness, redemption, and the transformative power of unconditional love. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, please comment. Your opinion is very important, and if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.